Professor Spieker teaches in the program of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Two of his works that I'll just highlight here that are certainly germane to the conference is The Big Archive, Art from Bureaucracy, which came out with MIT Press in 2008, and his Bürokratische Leidenschaften, which came out in 2004. I just wanted to say, though, that he has also, along with being the founding editor of Art Margins, he has several works that were quite central to my own experience as a student of Russian literature. Among the most important, maybe for the conference, is Gogol Exploring Absence and his really fantastic introduction to that. It was required reading really as a graduate student at Berkeley. And maybe it's also there that Gogol, whose language always circles around absence and negativity, it's a sort of a link from his various phases of his work. So welcome to NYU.
Thank you for that extremely kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me, Christina, for organizing this wonderful event. I'm very happy to be here. I should say my presentation is a lot more homespun, I think, than the polished ones that we've just heard. It's really a sort of a series of questions around an issue that I think is an interesting and important one, and one that interestingly came up already in the first presentation today, and that is the question of self-archiving. What does that mean, and what does it mean in relation to the archive, to self-archive? And once you start thinking about this question, specifically in relation to Eastern Europe and Russia and the former Soviet Union, then a whole slew of interesting and important questions arise. Not just, I might add, with regard to Eastern Europe, but self-archiving and exploring the relationship between the self and the archive is something that has concerned artists all over, not just in Eastern Europe, but there it somehow had specific significance. And already when you begin, I think, to think about the kind of connection of these two terms, self and archive, a whole sort of field of terms opens up that I think are as crucial as they become to be sort of entangled and difficult to disentangle when you begin thinking about them. So on the one hand, there's the question of archiving the self, opening up an important question about the relationship between, in my case, since I'm interested in art primarily here, the relationship between the artist and the archive created, the possibility or impossibility of subjecting the self to archivization, or perhaps even to create some form of self out of the archive, something, by the way, that especially in the digital age has taken on a particular currency, something that I can't talk about, but which is a vast and important field of creating subjectivities in relation to the archive, specifically the digital one. But here, in the kind of context of the analog archive, the question is as important and as compelling. What does it mean to create an archive that relates in one way or another to the construction of a self, particularly in the conditions of the former Eastern Europe? But then also self-archiving, of course, can also mean something else. It can be a sort of an auto-archiving, which again, in the age of big data has particular currency. The sort of idea that archives today do away with really what at one point was an incredibly important defining characteristic of an archive, which is that archives really didn't just describe a place where something was stored, but they described a whole architecture of different agencies that were involved in the production and then the registration and the archivization of an artifact. So we sort of seem to live in an age where that's often no longer the case, and self-archiving might then in this sense be a case where the production of a text, the production of something that will end up in the archive and its final consignment to the archive kind of coincide. This could be another meaning of the term auto-archivization. Once again, in that sense, it would be a rather paradoxical thing to happen, because it was precisely the distance between the act of consignment and the production of what it is that is being consigned that in some sense defined the archive traditionally. So for these to coincide, for the producer of the archive also be the one who performs the act of consignment is, from that perspective, a sort of a paradoxical thing to happen, but one that's worthwhile thinking about. Then there's the whole question of media, of course. Yeah, with regard and with relation to what specific media do we talk about self-archivization and archivization of self. So you notice that it's a sort of a loaded term that opens up a whole sort of range of subjects that could be discussed, and in 15 minutes, obviously, there isn't all that much time. It's worthwhile to even just create maybe a little overview when it comes to Eastern Europe of the many, many artists, initiatives, also archives involved in self-archivization, now more narrowly understood as efforts made by artists in Eastern Europe before 1989 to archive the activities of both individuals and groups, both on an institutional level and on the level of individuals involved or not involved in these activities. And I've just put a few of these together here. Not all of them belong to the period of before 1989, but most of them have some relationship to them. Maybe come back to this list in a little bit in a moment. And I put together just a few sort of ideas what I might mean by self-archiving when it comes to this talk. So I would say archiving would be the process of archiving one's life work or that of one's context. Say an artist group or the activity of such a group, and such self-archives can follow a plan or they cannot. I should add that they can be fictitious or they cannot be fictitious, or the boundary between their fictitious nature and their non-fictitious nature can be blurred altogether. A fictitious archive can become and be a real archive and vice versa. So these distinctions are not necessarily firm. Before 1989, and this is an important part of that I think needs to be mentioned and is often mentioned, self-archivization has a great deal to do with the absence in Eastern Europe, well, in many parts of Eastern Europe, of institutions in which artists could show or exhibit their work, so that the creation of archives served the important purpose of creating kind of self-created autonomy, if you will, spaces, in other words, where artists were able to show their work. These could be private, these could be semi-non-private and semi-institutional ways of creating a kind of boundary between the archive and its outside. Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of important constitutional aspect of an archive that there be some kind of boundary that separates the inside of an archive from the outside. You might say that when artists in Eastern Europe before 1989 created spaces that were dedicated to the showing, to the demonstration, to the presentation of art in one form or another, this was in a sense about the creation of this kind of boundary that separated the outside of the archive from its inside. That is, the space of the outside of that activity that the artists were engaged in from its inside. And this was an important aspect of self-archivization in Eastern Europe. Important examples include abt art in Russia, in Moscow, but many other forms that involve the creation of artist-run or created museums in apartments, in other alternative spaces, galleries, exhibitions, but also their documentation. So this was sort of an institutional aspect of self-archivization that's very important to mention. It was really ultimately about the creation of context. Yeah, that is, how can you create a context in which you can, with authority, demonstrate how something becomes art in some ways. Yeah, in other words, it's by no means clear how something becomes art, except in the West, what becomes art is in essence what is in a museum or in a gallery. If in Eastern Europe, alternative art, non-official art was generally speaking not in the official museums. So in order for this to happen, you needed to create a kind of a mechanism that would allow you to create or to to enable that shift to occur from the outside to the inside, as I mentioned, yeah, and in that way to demonstrate the mechanism that transforms something from non-art into art. This is a mechanism from which you were barred if you were not an official artist in Eastern Europe. Yeah? But then, of course, there were also many individual initiatives that involved self-archivization, that is, individual artists who created their own context, their own private, often fictitious context that mimicked these kinds of mechanisms, and I'll show a few examples of that in just a moment. Then there were instances where archives were part of the artistic practice of artists or artists' groups, and where archivization was a kind of, an intricate part of what the artists were doing, and where the archive in that way oscillated between being a tool that allowed artists to document for which otherwise there would be no documentation, since they were excluded from official forms of archivization, and artistic practices that involved the archive or archival media, as part of their activities. And often these two merged. And again, I'll show you examples of that. And then after 1989, at the bottom, I don't think I'll have time to even talk about that much. I'll probably limit myself to the period before 1989. I want to show you an example of an important instance of self-archivization that's often used as a kind of a reference point for people talking about this phenomenon in art. Marcel Duchamp's Boîte en valise, de ou par Marcel Duchamp ou Rose c'est la vie, 1933 to 1935, a kind of traveling suitcase. You've all seen this, in which Marcel Duchamp deposited, I guess, to which he consigned miniatures of his ready-mades, but also paintings. And that included typically one original. So this was both an instance of self-archivization, but also a comment, I suppose, on the relationship between the archive and originality and authenticity, and the way in which this perhaps needed to be rethought in the age of the ready-made. Again, an artwork that I can perhaps come back to later. Now, I have a kind of theoretical little tidbit that I won't go into now, but that if there is time, I want to come back later. I was sort of fascinated by a theory that Michel Foucault developed at the end of his life. It's called technology of the self. And I wanted to see, perhaps if there's time at the end or during the discussion, if self-archiving can count as what Foucault describes as a technology of self, which is a technology to change yourself, to make yourself over, to make yourself into an artist in some way, a theory that, or a sort of set of techniques that he associated first and foremost, I guess, with antiquity, and saw kind of famously corrupted in the modern age. But anyway, I don't want to read that tedious long slide right now. I'll come back to it maybe later on if there is time. Yeah. So maybe I'll just show you a few examples of self-archiving in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe before 1989, until we run out of time, and then we can maybe have some discussion about this. So one of the best known examples of self-archivization in the Soviet Union are these Mani folders that are sort of an outgrowth of the Moscow Conceptual School. And that were, in essence, launched by Andrei Monastyrsky, the founder of the performance group Коллективное действие. And I don't really necessarily want to go into the sort of history of this or explain what happened to these folders now, but they are an interesting instance of self-archivization that also creates the archive as a form of communication among a community for which there is no other, for which the communicative medium really is the archive in some ways. So these folders, 5 of them were started by members of the conceptual kind of network of artists in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, in the early 1980s. And whoever was given such a folder was instructed to fill it with various not really specified texts, drawings, could really be anything at all. There was no plan for this at all, but the idea was that you would then pass this on to somebody else who would then show it to others. So these archives or these folders became a kind of a means of communication as well as a way for a kind of auto-self-archivization. But crucially, they circulated. This was very important. So these became kind of mobile auto-archives, yeah, under the name, Moscow Archive of New Art, as a form of communication, first prepared by one artist and then passed on to others in the same circle. The Collective Actions Group, of which Andrei Monastyrsky was the founder, itself has an important link to archives. That is to say, their actions were from the very beginning very studiously and meticulously archived in various media, from specifically texts and photographs. The performances themselves relied to a large degree on different forms of archivization and on validation in some sense as an instance of archivization. Yeah? So at the end of each of these performances that involved the invitation extended to members of the extended group of these artists to come to a certain point, to travel to a certain point, often on the outskirts of Moscow, unknowingly, without really knowing what was going on. They took the bus to a field, let's say, as in this case, Appearance 1976, where they were exposed to strange happenings of which they had very little idea of what they were. And in the end, they were issued this, they were issued a kind of a document that validated or that confirmed their participation in an artwork. Yeah, but which also confirmed, or rather, confirmed the suspicion that they had been under surveillance in some sense, that the event in which they had participated was a staged event, that everything that they had been doing in traveling to this field, in being subjected to these mysterious appearances of others on snow-filled fields and so on, had been an instance of surveillance and of the archive in some ways. Yeah? So the archive really in some ways is the medium within which collective actions performs. It is not an incidental kind of afterthought. It is not something that merely is there to document what would have happened otherwise anyway. The archive really becomes a kind of productive principle under whose or within whose auspices or within whose field the whole sort of apparatus of collective actions unfolds. It wouldn't be the same if it weren't for these archival elements. So the archive is a productive rather than merely a validating kind of element in these performances. I'd mentioned already apt art. That is a form of exhibiting, bypassing official venues that were close to the members of the non-official art scene in the Soviet Union. In 1982, the first apt art exhibition happened. Apt art means, as the word says, apartment art, that is to say exhibitions that took place in a private apartment. You might say that in this case you're dealing with an effort to create an archive for the exhibition of artwork that otherwise couldn't be shown, but also for a very selective audience, of course. But these art exhibitions also served as important ways of documenting the activities of the members of this, of the non-official art scene in the Soviet Union at this time. An example of a fictitious self-archive is an installation by Ilya Kabakov entitled "The Man Who Never Threw Anything Away." As I mentioned before, self-archiving can be fictitious, but it can also blur the borderline between fiction and fact. Such archives are always also real. While they are fictitious, they're also real, and it is a very good example of the way in which the archive, understood by artists from the Soviet Union at this time, has this kind of totalizing ambition. That is a character who, you may have seen this well-known installation, essentially archives every aspect of his material existence, labels it, and attaches to it stories that belong to his sort of life surroundings. That is to say, he recreates his own apartment in the form of a meticulously documented archive. Yeah. So here you have a good example of the creation of a context, yeah, sort of an archival context in which the archive has taken over the life context, and where the apartment appears as what in essence amounts to a museum that problematizes constantly the relationship between what is being exhibited and the texts that describe it. The idea is then, furthermore, I think also to give an idea of how we configure the relationship between this archive and the construction of the self behind it. In other words, what is or who is the character behind this archive of the man who never threw anything away, and what can be the relationship between the thousands and thousands of trash items collected here on the one hand and the character who collected them. And here we have an example of one of these vitrines in which we almost witness this archive as if it was the result of a kind of self-surveillance, a kind of self-archivization that is the result of a kind of compulsive self-surveillance, and in which the self also fragments into these myriad objects whose connection to the character remains more or less obscure. A very different form of self-archive then are archives that were compiled to document the whole period of non-official art in the Soviet Union by people who were involved in these activities, artists primarily. So this is an example of Vadim Zakharov's archive. Really, his is the most important archive of Russian conceptualism that there is. Zakharov himself, a member of the Russian conceptualist, the Moscow conceptualist circle, who famously finds it extremely difficult to distinguish between his work as an artist and his work as an archivist. So he has a large archive in his Berlin home where he has collected material connected with the 1970s and the 1980s, beginning, I guess, in the late 1960s maybe, from the point of view of a participant. So he was centrally involved himself, and from this point of view collected this archive, from which then periodically he would also draw material for his own work, but he also sees this as the task of an historiographer. So the artist here becomes or is archivist, but also artist at the same time. He is a self-archivist in the sense that he is clearly archiving part of his own participation in these activities, but he's also the archivist or self-archivist in the sense that he's archiving the activities of the group of which he was once a part. Yeah? And in a sense, a group or a formation that no longer exists to the same degree that it did then, and who also finds, and this is quite curious, this self-archive a burden. Yeah? It's clear that when you talk to Vadim Zakharov, for him this archive has become as problematic as it is rich. It's something from which he feels he cannot sort of liberate himself. So a self-archive or self-archiving can actually become also a sort of constraining rather than liberating. You would think that an archive generally involves a way of kind of objectifying yeah? An objectification of something from which you, by dint of archiving it, also distance yourself. But self-archiving doesn't seem to offer that therapeutic effect. You can actually, since you are so centrally involved in what you archive, the archive can actually burden and oppress you. I find that an interesting thought that, that maybe Josef could actually tell us more about, you know, the archive or the self-archive as an oppressive force rather than something that's simply liberating. Just a few images from this archive of Vadim Zakharov's in Berlin, and at some point he created an installation that became quite well known, but it's really merely an illustration of the actual archive at his home, in which he classified the history of Russian nonconformist art as a series of file folders. And then in Eastern Europe, you know, the situation, of course, to some extent was different in that in Eastern Europe, in some countries at least, there were official outlets to show art even that was not part of the official canon. In Poland, this was the case, and in some other places to a very limited degree. There existed galleries in which artists could show their work. But nevertheless, this thesis about the need to create a kind of sort of self-administered mechanism that allows you to shift art from the sphere outside of what is art, the non-art, into the inside of those self-administered institutions and archives, that mechanism still needed to be created largely by artists themselves. Examples of artists who put together archives that chronicled non-official art of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s involve Sofia Kulik's archive in Poland, but then also artwork that involves instances of archives concerning the self of the artist, as in this case, Netko Solakov's Top Secret, a file with index cards, some of which bears a relation to Solakov's involvement with the secret police in Bulgaria. So the archive as a kind of, or the self-archive as sort of an exposure to some extent, or the filter through which one's exposure to the mechanisms of state surveillance could be presented and demonstrated. An example of this. Solakov has since gone on to create quite a few works that involve folders that chronicle to some degree the history of Bulgaria during the Cold War. This is the most recent of these, the folders from 2011. Works with files like this one called Missing, which I don't think I have time to really focus on a great deal. We already mentioned Supreal's archive with the Arta photo archive in this installation at the Künstlerhaus Britannien in Berlin. Not to say that all these instances of self-archivization are homogeneous or the same. Obviously, they are not. East Art Map, the effort by the Yugoslav art collective Irvin to create a map involving Eastern European alternative art practices in the form of a map. And lastly, retro avant-garde, more a method than anything else to deal with the phenomenon of Eastern European modernism. So my time is really up, and I haven't had time to even get to Foucault's concept of technologies of the self, but maybe we can make up for that in the Q&A. If you guys have any questions or comments, I'd be grateful, and I can maybe work that into the discussion. Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to know, I became interested in this problem of technologies of the self. Yeah, what Foucault means by it is a famously contested concept, yeah, essentially because he derives it from ancient techniques of taking care of oneself. Yeah. The idea was such techniques used to lead to knowledge of oneself. Yeah? So taking care of oneself meant becoming to know oneself. And his idea is that in the modern era, there's been some kind of reversal whereby now knowledge of the self is itself seen as taking care of oneself. And he writes that technologies of the self, to quote him, permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts and conduct, and a way of being so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. And he views the technologies of the self today as corrupted, saying the techniques of the self have been embedded either in some authoritarian or disciplinary structure or substituted for and transformed by public opinion, mass media, polling techniques which play a formative role in our attitudes towards others and towards ourselves, so that the culture of the self is imposed on people by the other and the culture of the self has lost its independence. My idea was that we would discuss whether or not the activity of archiving one's self could count as a technology of the self in this sense, whether by dint of creating an archive of the self, of oneself, but also maybe of a group with which one was involved, as in the case of, let's say, Moscow conceptualism, we could speak about a technology of the self. Was that a way of changing the culture within which one worked, of actively, so rather than just creating a kind of more or less passive space for preserving, for documenting, things that happened and that one felt were important to be preserved in some way, was it an active way of also working on this culture, of actually bringing about a certain change in one's own attitude towards oneself, yeah, or towards the group within which one worked? In other words, is archiving a form of producing a self, and in these conditions which I've described? And can it count as being what Foucault refers to, effecting through a certain number of operations, thoughts and conduct and way of being, a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality?
Regarding archiving as a practice, some artists, it would seem, would do so either because the gallery system and the official system of trading or exhibiting your work does not allow for certain types of work that's created. That's true in the West, was even truer in the East. The other aspect too, of course, there are artists who are creating works, whether they're action artists or performance artists, who, due to the ephemeral nature of their work, it becomes archived ultimately in its surviving form or format as an unavoidable aspect. So I'm wondering to what degree you would say that artists in the East, or an artist that don't have as extensive a gallery, or historically, that's changed now, but historically did not have as much of a gallery or commercial aspect to the arts market in terms of displaying and sharing it and showing it, to what degree that it was basically a choice that people had no choice but to make in terms of archiving work or what they were doing versus non-traditional works.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. You put it in a nutshell. That's exactly the reason why a lot of these archives came into being, and a lot of the works, the artworks themselves dealing with archives, in some sense, sort of simulate that same necessity, this necessity to create a context, and to create this relationship that I mentioned between inside and outside, and to model the shift from outside to inside. That was necessary to, if you will, simulate the kind of institutional realities that you have, for example, in the West, with a functioning system of museums and galleries. So to a large extent, I think, yes, it was a form of compensation for the lack of such outlets in Eastern Europe. I'm not sure it explains everything, but I do think that self-archiving served that important function, absolutely, yes.
Thank you. I have two questions. First one is about your interest after 1989, if you're also looking at artists who use, in a way, self-archiving, but it's self-mediated archiving. For instance, taking the archive from secret police and then using it. And the other question is, could you say something about this self-archiving in juxtaposition to the so-called official archiving, the political archiving of secret police at that time? If there is, what do you think is the relationship?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in general terms, maybe not, but it's clear that under the conditions, I mean, you might say that in the Soviet Union, for example, you lived in a giant archive. Yeah, I mean, every conversation, every phone conversation you had was from the beginning archival, to the extent that it could be, and perhaps was, depending on the circumstances, archived, that it was recorded in some way, or that it could be recorded. And you know, the archive had a certain materiality to it. There were certain clicks and sounds in the telephone that you heard when you picked up the receiver, and I still remember that. You could hear that. Yeah, that was the archive calling in some ways. So there was a sort of general assumption of archivization. So the archive was nothing exotic. It was nothing particularly far from you when you lived in the Soviet Union, also an extremely bureaucratic society. Its official sphere was very much, you know, dominated by the media of administration, of bureaucracy, of archive, and so on. So in some ways, for artists to turn to this type of material reality was nothing special. It wasn't an aesthetic. It wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was working with what you found in your day-to-day life and reality. Yeah, you lived in the archive was everywhere in some ways. Yeah, so the reasons for which, let's say, conceptual artists in the West turn to these same things like files and folders and what has been called the aesthetic of administration were perhaps quite different. But in the Soviet Union, let's say, maybe in Eastern Europe the case is again a bit different, but these things were everywhere. Yeah, so it didn't take a great deal. So for Kabakov, for example, to create or to recreate the life of a character as an archive was, in a sense, just to sort of present the negative, if you will, of, you know, that person's real life, which was just a normal messy Soviet apartment, but to kind of recreate it as an archive was just to say, well, you know, this is the negative of the reality in which we live, is to see that archive. If you could put on a pair of glasses, archive glasses, that's what you would see from the point of view of Soviet officialdom. That's what that apartment would really look like. It would be a bunch of meticulously documented little, you know, material pieces, you know, annotated, you know, recorded, transcribed, and so on, and everything would turn out in this way. So this is to answer your question, you know, what is the relationship between this and official archives? In some sense, these archives were working within that big official big archive that they perceived as being their living reality, I feel. And so, you know, they created sort of counter versions of that in some ways.
Further to that, as an archivist myself, we talk a lot about this concept of intellectual control. And the way that I see your talk and the work of these unofficial artists in dialogue with the other presentations is this idea of the artists kind of covertly creating their own archive outside of the context of institutions. So it's sort of like, I guess it's more of a symbiotic relationship that I see between like this concept of constantly being archived through surveillance and then also like sort of secretly producing an archive. It sort of subverts the power structure there, I feel, within the context of the Soviet Union. Do you think that that was deliberate, or do you think that that was more just, as you said, like the context that they were working in and what they saw as the materiality of their life, I guess?
Whether there's something
deliberately subversive about producing their own archives for unofficial artists who are not, you know, working within the context of these institutions.
Yeah, absolutely, it was. I mean, these institutions didn't exist, so the you know, institutions really weren't a reference point for you. But the archive, as I said, became also a medium of communication for these artists. And again, the reason was that that archivization and archives were part of the reality they, I think, lived and experienced. So these things were so subversive, yes, to an extent, because they appropriated perhaps, fragments of this reality for themselves and reworked it in ways that were somehow. But I'm not sure subversive is such a loaded term. It's a bit difficult. Not sure.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah.
Fascinating talk. Thanks so much. I just the little archive, the little books you showed reminded me of something, and this is more an example. In some ways I want help with this too, rather than anything else, but it reminded me of that whole practice of keeping scrapbooks of stuff in the Soviet Union, which was a major thing. People would order, for instance, there was that whole industry of ordering newspaper excerpts. You just order them and put them in things that were interesting to you, and so lots and lots of people had these things, right? So it could be about you if you were a famous person, or it could be something you're interested in. Lots of people had these things, right? And they would put not just newspapers, but other things. But here's I think that what's interesting about these kinds of collections is that they would be used in various ways. I mean, the same archive could have different uses. So, for instance, Vertov, in 1935, he won the Order of the Red Star. Okay, this was a big deal. There were photographs published in Pravda and Izvestia and so forth of him in a room with Stalin and Molotov and all the rest of the recipients of this thing and so forth. But one of the main people giving the award was Yanukidze, who of course was purged in 1937. So what you see in the scrapbooks is images there, and then he'll have blacked out the face of Yanukidze, and sometimes his hands too. You'd see his hands that would be blacked out. In some of the photos, in a couple of them, but then there are other photos in exactly the same scrapbook where you'll get a close-up of Yanukidze from the same event. And he's totally there. There's no, you see his face and there's no blacking out or anything. Why? Why is this? Now, here's my theory, okay? One, he could be just stupid, right, that he didn't do this. But my sense is that actually the reason is that when they had guests over, they would say, Denis Arkadyevich, show us the famous photograph to guests, right, of when you got the Order of the Red Star. And he would open the book to that photograph, right, the one that has Stalin in it and so forth. There you are, wonderful, and close the thing, right? You see what I'm saying? That there would be this kind of, that's completely hypothetical, right? Mm-hmm. But that there would be these different kinds of ritual, self-presentational functions of these things. At the same time, what he wanted to do was collect every last scrap of photographic and other evidence about this event. So I'm just bringing that up as an example, not even as a question, but as something that sort of points to the history of this kind of collection and the sort of the complexities of social practice that might be involved in that and so on, which you're totally aware of. But it's just, I'm just really provoked to think about that actually by your wonderful presentation more than anything else.
Well, also because I think it points us to an important point, which is the uses of archives are very crucial. Yeah, the way in which archives circulated, that they weren't just this thing that you went to visit in some place that was. But with these artist archives, generally you're looking at archives that are highly mobile. I mean, already in Duchamp's archives, a suitcase. Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. So the mobility of archives, which by the way is also, I suppose, something that characterizes film as archive in some ways.
And the mobility of the audience.
And the mobility of the audience, yes. Yeah.
I can ask my question later over.
No, please.
Okay. Well, my question is actually kind of naive, but is there a relationship between the kind of very self-conscious archiving you're talking about and what I thought of in the through the 90s as the kind of Soviet, post-Soviet archiving that you would see in people's apartments, which I think had to do with material scarcity more than anything else. When you would see a pretty cigarette box next to some kind of tin or can or a candy wrapper next to a family photograph. Is there any relationship between these practices at all, or is it just completely different?
So when you, can you explain that? So when you see...
yes, like through the 1990s, for example, if you were in a middle class, what I would describe as a middle class post-Soviet apartment, there would often be a glass cabinet with objects in it that were often from the West, although not always, and they were kind of aestheticized because they were taken out of their context. Maybe it was a cigarette box or something like that. And they had been saved, and it felt like an archive to me. and in a much more naive way, obviously. And I'm just wondering if, and I think that was because of material scarcity, obviously, and possibly some kind of aesthetic deprivation that came with material scarcity. But I'm just wondering if it relates at all to this very sophisticated kind of archiving practice.
Right, so, I mean, those were sort of archives that simulate consumption in a way, right? They simulate consumption of consumer goods and desires to acquire them, maybe.
And memory, too, though.
Right.
They would have a memory tied up with this
Yeah.
candy box or something.
So some of the projects that at least I've shown, they feed more on the bureaucracy in some ways. Yeah? So it's less about consumption. It's sort of order consumption, I suppose. It's about, so I don't know, maybe some relationship could be constructed. I don't see any immediate one. But yeah. Yeah.
So please join me in thanking our panelists.